Today during Dobhe Virtuur. Good evening, everyone. I am going to talk tonight about the notion of propaganda and specifically the notion of propaganda art. And of course, that means that we have to somehow clarify these terms. What is propaganda? What's propaganda art? Also, if enforced tonight that I speak too fast or something is not clear, or you're too bored, you could just tell me to raise your hand. When we think of propaganda, the first association, the first popular association is with the history of what we tend to call totalitarianism. Propaganda in that context becomes a symbol of oppressive power that creates kind of violent, self-aggrandized image of great leaders, heroic soldiers, joyous peasants, imposed upon a population. Of course, the work of the Russian art historian Igor Bohnstock was all about this, conceptualizing this notion of totalitarian art. His theory was that from the art production under fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the Chinese People's Republic, there was a continuous, almost totalitarian aesthetic machinery at play that reproduces every time the similar kind of image and aesthetics. I don't agree with that proposition, but this idea that the Aryan artist somehow is this homogeneous aesthetic entity, I think continues to kind of haunt our perception of what is propaganda, and most of all, what is not propaganda. So, one big misconception about propaganda is that propaganda will somehow would be a concept or a practice born out of dictatorship. But propaganda historians for a long time have emphasized that the very first modern propaganda bureau was known as Wellington House. It was created at the end of the Second Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, the beginning of the First World War. And Wellington House, Wellington House used in its propaganda operation an international cable network that is known as the All Red Line, which I will show you if the image would not be missing. The All Red Line was a colonial cable network that connected the UK to its different colonies abroad. But when the First World War started, the UK started to use it through this first propaganda bureau, Wellington House, as a kind of gigantic information filter, a kind of the NSA before we knew about the NSA as we know it today. And they showed that the core of propaganda is not so much this obvious image of imposed power, but is actually about controlling information at the very source, being able to capture information of your opponent, insert misinformation, redirect information. To say simple, propaganda is about infrastructure, and this international cable network was the first example of the use of propaganda from this infrastructural level. So this is important insofar as that it shows that propaganda, that the first modern forms of propaganda emerged in, well, it's not exactly called a democracy, but an imperial democracy, like the United Kingdom. It goes even so far that in Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, Hitler recalls the sophistication of the modern propaganda of the British. He writes about the time in the trenches where the leaflets of the British were being dropped, trying to undermine the morale of the German soldiers. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler argues, we lost the First World War not as a military war, we lost it as a propaganda war. And our side didn't understand anything about the importance of the narrative that was built between who was the enemy and who was the right, let's say, the right side in the war. So Hitler would largely build his propaganda apparatus, his frightening propaganda apparatus, based on the heritage of the British. So here, that doesn't mean, of course, that British propaganda is the same as Nazi propaganda, but it shows that there was a development from British propaganda onwards throughout the Nazi propaganda machinery and the Soviet propaganda machinery, etc., etc. A large misconception also about Nazi propaganda is that we tend to associate it with posters like these. There you would be the famous propaganda movie that in a very disturbing way edits the movie in which Jews are being equated to vermin, to cockroaches, to rats, to a plague. That this narrative, which we today see in other versions, but mostly directed at Muslim population. This type of imagery has come to haunt also our idea of what propaganda is. But even in Nazi Germany, it was very difficult to force people to convince people to actually see them. Members of the Nazi party were obliged to watch propaganda movies. It was like a duty part of the membership, because otherwise people would just not come. People in Nazi Germany, just as we are today, were just as susceptible to excessive ideological indoctrination. Much more popular in Nazi Germany were movies like these, Der große Liebe, kind of like the equivalent of Nazi Hollywood. A love story about the man meets a woman, of course, in the background. The man is also fighting at the front on behalf of the Nazi regime, etc., etc. But that is almost background. The real story is about family issues and about the questions of love and marriage and the love for small animals, whatever. It was like a soap or entertainment series as we would see it today. It was very effective though, because in the background, of course, there were no more enemies. There were no representatives of the Jewish people. There were the Nazi flag was behind every corner in every shot. That's somewhere in the background as the new normal. We don't have to talk about it anymore. This is how the world has become. Just to say that in propaganda studies, this is called the difference between overt and covert propaganda. So covert propaganda would be forms of propaganda of which we are not necessarily aware that they are taking place, like the British did with their cable network, controlling information without us knowing who is controlling the information. Overt propaganda would be much more obvious, ideological and doctrinal manifestation of propaganda. So there is an uncomfortable relationship between propaganda and democracy. And interwar propagandists, so let's say that the first propaganda scientists that developed in the interwar period between First and Second World War, like Edward Bernays, famous figure, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who would popularize psychoanalysis as a new tool of mass engineering, of public relations, you would call it. Actually, you call it propaganda, but then he realized it was better to call it public relations because there would be a more successful, less haunting, less confrontational way of using the term. He saw propaganda, Bernays, as a way of solving what he considered the problems of democracy. Bernays said humans are fundamentally incapable of self-governing, of making rational decisions, because they are being manipulated all the time. Not only by forces from the outside, commercially and politically, they're also haunted by their own unconscious desires. They don't even know what they want. How could they ever vote? So his answer to that was a new model of democracy, which he presented at the World Fair of 1939 in this gigantic sphere, this dome that you see on the left side, a project he called Democracy. Here you see the architectural model from the inside. So that was his vision of a completely corporately run a city governed by public relations industry, which would use focus groups and public relations experts to map the desires of the inhabitants, even before the inhabitants could know what were their desires. So the city was democratic not because anyone voted or anyone joined unions or political parties. It was democratic because it knew what its citizens wanted before its citizens could know what they want. This is, of course, a completely perverse form of preemptive democracy. So there's never a formal democracy, there's only a preemptive democracy through this corporatization of psychoanalysis. So democracy has its own propaganda history, but a key characteristic of democratic propaganda compared to dictatorial propaganda is that it does everything to remain undetectable as such, in order to maintain the idea of a free and open society, etc. to move to the present. These just as some case studies of different developments around the notion of propaganda. Today we've become familiar with terms like fake news, alternative facts, and what is called the so-called post-truth era of politics. Of course, the notion of post-truth is I think, is a form of kind of liberal propaganda itself. Because what it suggests is that with Trump and the rise of authoritarian politicians the world over, we have moved in a period in which there's no more truth. So post-truth suggests we are past the truth. But it, at the same time, suggests that we have to go back to the truth as it was. But when was that truth? What are we supposed to go back to? To the Obama years in which there were more immigrants removed from the country than any year before, any presidency before? Are we supposed to go back to the Bush era, to the tax era, to the Reagan era? I mean, what the hell are we supposed to go back to? What was the truth that we're supposed to belong to? So I mean, post-truth is used a lot by nostalgic liberals who can't believe that we've come into the age of authoritarianism, and that neoliberal austerity is no longer normal, but that for should not be normal in the first place. Anyway, sidetrack, sorry. What is important, what is strange, of course, is that when we talk about fake news, alternative fact, post-truth, we don't really talk about propaganda. Still today, it's like the term doesn't apply. When it's North Korea, absolutely. If it's the Soviet Union using trolls to derail the American elections, of course, propaganda. Because these regimes, these contexts, we expect to make propaganda. But democracies, well, almost propaganda, but not really. This is, of course, the core narrative of democratic propaganda. Democracy has to stand in absolute opposition to this age of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. In my research, I refer to propaganda as the performance of power. And with that, I mean that propaganda manifests the moment that infrastructures of power, like politics or the economy or the mass media or the military industrial complex, are enacted, are put into motion in order to shape reality after a particular set of interests. And what is very important for me is to emphasize that propaganda is never one poster or one film or one artwork. Propaganda is about engineering reality as such. It has to take place on as many possible levels as possible. On the micro level, conversations at the dinner table, at work. On the macro level, the voting booth, up until the next war that we're being dragged into. Propaganda only works when it creates a total environment like Der Böse Liebe, the film, in which the symbols of Nazi Germany are just a background. They are the new normal. You've accepted it as a new reality. Of course, the work of Trevor Bigelow and showing on the background are a great example of this infrastructural dimension of propaganda. For those who don't know it, Trevor Peggy is an American artist who has dedicated a lot of his work to trying to photograph and map, classify sites, NSA data centers, the kind of infrastructures of the contemporary world in the war on terror. The centers of power that try to engineer our reality, the substructure of our society, you could say. So, already in the late 80s, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman identified that to construct reality, let's say this is the goal of propaganda. Propaganda is performance of power. It aims to construct reality after a set of specific interests. Chomsky Herman argues that propaganda makes use of filters to manufacture consent. These are the filters that they identified: monopolization, corporate advertising, solid source control, etc. And what they call the manufacturing of consent, with that they mean to create a normative reality, so to construct a new reality based on particular ideological ideas, attitudes, and behaviors. So one of such propaganda filters, the first one, is monopolization, and that relates to the need, to the necessity for propaganda to own and control as many communication channels as possible. to change normative values in a given society. Another example, the fourth filter, is FLAG, and that is essentially the equivalent of fake news, what we call fake news. So what is that? That means consciously inserting misinformation to derail a mainstream narrative. For example, climate change is real. And the goal of fake news, or the goal of FLAG, is to derail, at least to create enough doubt to challenge this assumption. And of course, there is a filter that is called anti-communism, which relates to, of course, Chomsky and Herman made this model in the late 80s, so the end of the Cold War. Anti-communism, the filter relates to the need to create an enemy, the projection of an enemy. With the projection of an enemy, we can start to define who we are. So this is the process of creating an us versus a them. Or in sociology, it's called the difference between the in-group, we, and the out-group, them. Of course, today, we know this filter in a contemporary version. It's the anti-Islamist filter, as the Nigel Farage of UKIP during the Brexit campaign showed clearly with this poster, Breaking Point, the EU has killed us all. This idea, this perverse idea of a tsunami of refugees that are somehow trying to re-enter into the empire, which they are, of course, completely entitled to, given the history of the Internet. So, propaganda can be defined as performance of power. It aims to construct a new reality based on the manufactured consent, values, attitudes, and behaviors that strengthen the elites that employ propaganda in the first place. And of course, here in Poland, this is a process that you have become familiar with in the most terrifying way, trying to change the consent and the core values based on which a common reality is built. And that goes from challenging the independence of the judiciary system, that goes to challenging the right of women to control and decide their own reproductive rights, the attack on public education, on disability support, etc., etc. You were more familiar with it than me. This is, of course, an example of a process in which, on a massive level, from the smallest and biggest scale, the values of the society and the institutions and its infrastructures are shifting from one set of principles to another. Now the question that is the center of to my talk, how does this whole process relate to art and culture? If propaganda aims to construct a new reality, how then is reality imagined? How is it visualized? In other words, how does the performance of power, how is power performed as art? If the performance of power is propaganda, then the performance of power as art is propaganda. So, as Jan mentioned, a recent exhibition project that I realized called Steve Bannon, a Propaganda Retrospective, tries to investigate that, explore this question. It's a part of my work, as I refer to as propaganda research, trying to map the role of art and culture in dominant regimes of power. In this case, relating to the figure of Steve Bannon. For those not familiar with who is Bannon, Bannon was the main campaigner of Donald Trump in the year 2016. He was an advisor to Trump. He was the co-founder and financer and editor of Breitbart News, a self-declared home of the alt-right, the alternative right, the white nationalist and white supremacist movements, online movements that developed in the wake of Trump's regime. Now, Bannon's history starts, you could say, in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, when he joined Goldman Sachs Investment Bank. And with that knowledge, becoming this kind of venture capitalist figure, with that knowledge, he starts various projects. This is well before he joins Trump or the American alt-right. The most curious is probably Biosphere 2, which you see here, of which Bannon was a CEO, leading director for 2 years, not a little bit more, I think, 3 years. And Biosphere 2 is the largest closed ecosystem that was ever built on Earth. And its aim was to replicate different climates of Earth with the aim of testing the possibility of interplanetary colonization. So is it possible that when we would move to Mars, we would create a secondary biosphere? So this was a testing ground, which didn't work at all. People were not able to survive there. Insects were taking, one certain insect was taking over all of the other areas of the construction. It was a huge financial debt. This is when Bannon was involved from Goldman Sachs to save the project. And he said, very smartly, very intelligently, we had to repurpose this project because of the enormous amount of CO2 in the air of this, in the atmosphere of this biosphere. We could use it to test the consequences of climate change. And of course, this was a time in which between Republicans and liberals and Democrats, there was a consensus that climate change was real. Even capitalism needs climate to exploit. So if we don't have one anymore, but even that doesn't work anymore. So Bannon was able to turn it into this scientific research center and take it out of the, let's say, take it out of its financial crisis. Of course, this stands in huge contrast with the Bannon that we know, that convinced Trump to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It shows that he, as a propagandist, is someone who can change narratives depending on what the situation demands. At one moment, it can be consensus of climate change. At the other moment, it can be consensus of a new alt-right world order. But simultaneously, the biosphere is also a great metaphor for how I define propaganda. Not as a single message, as a complete environment, a complete alternative parallel world that is being constructed as a biosphere. Now, what the exhibition Steve Bannon Propaganda Retrospective tried to do is to trace how Bannon's different cultural projects, like Biosphere, but particularly his films, because Bannon made 9 films between 2004 and 2016, and he's about to release his new film in the next month. It will be his death. How did this cultural work inform his later propaganda work? At what level is the propaganda artist Bannon did he create the imagination, the stories, the value system out of which Trumpism emerged? To answer that question, it's interesting to quickly move through some of the key Conrad Bannon's P works. His very first film from 2004 was titled In the Face of Evil, Reagan's War, E Word and B. So this is a movie that was made quite quickly after September 11. It's a kind of turning point for Bannon in which the more kind of Hollywood liberal Bannon that supports theories on the real existing climate change shifts to a more conservative side of the political spectrum. And in his film, he narrates the history of Reagan's fight against the Soviet Empire, which ends with a very contemporary image. He attacks on the Twin Towers, and here you see a still from the film that if you look well, you can see out of the smoke of the Twin Towers, the ghost of Osama bin Laden emerges. And the core of this film is that it shows a core philosophy of Bannon, namely that the fight against evil, he calls it first fascism, then communism, and then Islamic terrorism, is cyclical. It's generational. There's never one enemy that can be conquered. One enemy is always just one face of a multi-headed evil. And every generation, time and again, has to confront and overcome these people. And in order to do so, we need strong leader figures like Reagan, who are able to lead civilization into the process, Christian Western civilization, into the process of its rebirth, confront this existential people. Now this idea of a kind of cyclical time, not a progressive time, but a cyclical time, the endless return of evil, is based on a group called the Fourth Turning. This is, let's say, Bannon's philosophical body. It's written by Strauss and Howe in 1999. And it argues that civilizations rise and fall in 4 generations. And the authors of this book, they call it 4 turnings. And that process moves from rebirth to decay and rebirth. At the core is a very conservative idea that after a great crisis, like the Second World War, societies re-emerge, like the America of the 50s, strong family values, strong Christian values, a free market within national borders, strong communal sense. This is the first turning, the rebirth of society. But already in the second turning, a kind of internal degeneration begins. The rise of hippies, animism, flower power movements, progressivists, what Bannon considers kind of obsession with individual desire, individual gratification, which then leads to a third turning of growing crisis. What Bannon calls the globalist elites, that calls the 2008 economic crisis. He sees that as the inheritors of the hippies. We go from the hippies to Wall Street. This obsession with self-gratification becomes a globalized culture, and in the process we lose these core values of religion and family and community, etc. And inevitably, it weakens society. And with the weakening of society comes a chance for great enemies to emerge, like Osama bin Laden, great enemies from outside that have to be defeated. And a new leader figure is necessary to fight so that society can rebirth and then restart the whole process again. This is the core of this book. And it's the core philosophy of Bannon, and we see that most strongly in the way that he uses visual metaphors. So one thing that I tried to do with this exhibition is to trace all the visual metaphors that Bannon uses in his 9 films and to categorize that. So for example, in almost all of his films, there's a use of predatory animals. The sharks are the most popular, and the sharks always represent subsurface forces that we cannot see on the surface, but at any moment can rupture and tear apart the fabric of our reality. The sharks, of course, stand for economic crisis, forces that we cannot control, cannot see, and that overtake our societies and given objects. But the metaphors that come very close to the idea of cyclical time are his continuous use of storms and natural catastrophes, although of course they're not that natural considering the context of climate change, but that aside. So the images of the storm, they announce this fourth turning, this coming of a grave class of civilizations, a fight against internal enemies, cultural Marxists and hedonists and the globalist elite, and external enemies, Islamic terrorism, the rise of North Korea, you name it. So this is the kind of eerie beginning, but very quickly these natural phenomena then become human phenomena. So the way that storms manifest is the way that almost every one of Bannon's movies, there are dollar bills. They're flying around, they're being flushed, they're being burned. They show the moment that in Bannon's view, a free market is no longer operating under a higher authority, the authority of God and the family, the nation, but becomes a value in and of itself. And the moment that man declares itself God is the moment that value itself evaporates, flies away, burns. In other words, this almost prophetic view of history and shows that for Bannon there's not really a difference between natural phenomena and human phenomena. We're somehow all part of the same cycle, and this process of cyclical time and this rebirth and fall of civilization is almost inevitable. So the enemies, the enemies within, the enemies outside are clear already in the Reagan film. The enemies within are the cultural Marxists. Of course, cultural Marxism has a long history. I don't know, it's being used actively here in discourse, political discourse. In the Netherlands, for example, it's the idea that it's an original term used by Nazis, the cultural Bolsheviks. Today is cultural Marxists. The idea that a often left or Jewish-left alliance is trying to operate in a kind of shadow government through our universities and through our public institutions to slowly take over power and collectivize the state from within. And for Bannon and cultural Marxism, this danger that developed from the 60s onwards, from the second turning onwards, is embodied by the figure of Saul Alinsky, the writer of Rules for Radicals. Alinsky was a Jewish American community organizer. This book, from a European perspective, is not that left. It's more like the social democratic left. It's very pragmatic. It's about trying to mobilize and politicize communities, assemble different communities, find common values, a common narrative to struggle for a more just or more egalitarian society. It's extremely pragmatic. It's also called pragmatic handbook for radicals. But Bannon builds, and many other conservatives, built a whole narrative around Alinsky as if he's somehow the kind of ideological inspirer of various political movements, from Occupy Wall Street to the Obama-led administration to the unions. There is the idea of this underground assembly of left forces. I wish it was true. I don't think it's the case. In the exhibition, we distributed, I think, 2,500 copies of Alinsky. So it was part of one of the rooms analyzing cultural Marxism, but it was also a way of propagating this idea of a cultural Marxism. So let's see, if this is the enemy, what can we learn from this handbook? What can we learn from this, considering that we are the enemy too? What can we learn from these core lessons? Important in the course of the exhibition is the way that all of these cultural ideas developed by Bannon through his films, through various side projects, how have these informed the first year of the Trump administration, the year in which Bannon was still at his side as his main advisor? Bannon has a particular cinematic theory. He calls his work kinetic cinema. It's extremely fast-paced, very strong hearing music, continuously pushing forward, cynical edits in which at one moment we're looking at the Occupy protester, the other moment we're looking at an Islamic State militant, trying to create this idea of kind of multi-headed beast and the within and the outside. It's like he says that in his work he wants to overwhelm an audience with a narrative so powerful and set images so overwhelming that it's almost impossible to orient where truth began and where it ended. In some way, Trump's campaign was a kinetic campaign. It was Bannon's cinematic theory in the political realm. And a good example of how this translated was this very first press conference that Trump gave while he was still president-elect, in which, after massive pressure to hand over his tax returns and divest from his companies, from his Trump empire, he organized this public session together with his lawyer, in which he was standing next to a table with an enormous amount of files, supposed to be the files of his companies, that he was handing over to his sons. So hereby, the divestment has taken place. It was a press conference that was reconstructed in the exhibition. And the reason why this was important is that a journalist of The Independent that was present at this press conference was able to get to the States afterwards and realize that there was nothing in the folders. I mean, it was paper, but there was nothing in paper. So this was a prop. This was a complete cinematic prop. And of course, every press conference is theater. But here, there's something else that happens. This is, it embodies, in a way, the core dynamic of Trumpism, which is a kind of governance by meme. So meme are like popular images and GIFs that we share through media. There's particular right-wing and alt-right GIFs, like our memes, like the famous Pepe the Frog, that is used to kind of convey extreme right messages, but through a kind of funny or ironic cartoon. But Trump essentially governs by me, meaning that at first his propositions are not meant to be realized. They're meant to be shared. They're meant to enter into our world as ideas. I'm going to build a wall. I'm handing over my tax returns. I'm going to arm teachers so that they can protect their students. Half the time, Congress doesn't know, his own administration doesn't know, his ministries doesn't know, there's no budget for his proposals. They are meant to direct the discussion. They are meant to shift our orientation points of the reality we live in. And what first seems unacceptable slowly becomes the new normal. And of course, in the process, too much of his ideas do get realized, like the so-called Muslim ban. So these memes are not innocent. But at first, their first importance, their first goal is to dominate the discussion, to dominate the narrative. Of course, there's now a greater example of that capacity of controlling narrative is Bannonist capacity to turn histories around in against themselves until they fit whatever purpose we want them to have. Then the press conference of August 15, in which Trump is pushed for his lack of taking distance from the United the Right rally in Charlottesville, massive rally of neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan members. And when he's pushed and pushed to fundamentally take distance from this bold right elements that support his administration, he says, but what about the old left that came charging and the old right? Don't they have any guilt? Guilt was on both sides. This is, of course, a brilliant turnaround that Bannon in his own work has exercised many times. When the conservatives were critiqued for being anti-feminist, he made a biopic, Sarah Palin. I don't know if you remember Bannon calls her Trump before Trump, as Tea Party figurehead in the anti-Obama movement. And he presents her as the ultimate feminist, anti-feminist. Here you see, we conservatives, we the right elite, we do have strong women, but our strong women stand for family values. They stand against abortion. It's like the complete turnaround, an instant turnaround. And this old left, the old right into the old, turning the old right into the old left is a very similar way of spinning narrative. Of course, this press conference is also, although it's an extreme Bannonist moment, he was still a chief advisor, it was also the moment in which pressure against the Trump administration mounted to get rid of Bannon, to get rid of the alt-right elements in his administration, which are of course still there, and Bannon leaves the White House. And that leads to one of the final works of the exhibition, which is called The Disappearance of Steve Bannon. It's the secret soup. Because as months pass, a book is published at the time, Fire a Fury, of inside look in the White House, in which Bannon is interviewed various times, accusing Bush Jr. of being a traitor for handing over, for trying to get information from the Russians against then opponent Hillary Clinton. And Trump fundamentally distances himself from Bannon. An attack against his family is unacceptable, and he always was always disturbed by the fact that everyone considered Bannon as the kind of genius behind Trump, which is something that very much fits the logic of authoritarianism in relationship to art. I don't know if some of you know the book, The Total Art of Stalinism by Roald Boyce, in which he argues that in the art of Stalinism, total art of Stalinism, in the end, only Stalin can be the author. No one can offer Stalin. Stalin must be the author of the world. And of course, with Trumpism, it's very similar. Trumpism, in many ways, is a Bannonism. The core ideas of fighting for a white Christian economic nationalist doctrine, these are Bannonist ideas, and he developed it throughout 15 years of his films. First around Biden, later around Trump. The core narrative is the same. But in the total art of Trumpism, only Trump can be the author of Trump. No one can be considered as a co-author in the process. So literally, Bannon is written out of the history of Trump, shaded in the process, even by his former protégés, which is why I made this image. This is not an official press image, in which I removed Bannon the same way that Trotsky would be removed from images standing next to Stalin. The same way authoritarian propaganda art always tries to restage history in favor of the authoritarian author and him or herself. Of course, the disappearance of Bannon from Trump simply means his reappearance somewhere else. His reappearance now, unfortunately, is in Europe. You saw him this summer give press conferences and speeches at the rallies of the Front National in France, led by an independent party founded by Nazis. We saw him stand next to Lega, representatives of the Lega, like Salvini in Italy. We saw him appear next to the Alternative for Germany, that has been one of the leading voices in the massive neo-Nazi rallies in China in the past weeks. And this is part of a larger plan, the creation of a new Europe-based organization called The Movement, with which Bannon wants to support what is now called the Nationalist International, so the alliance of parties from Law and Justice to Fidesz, from AfD to the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, the Freedom Party in Austria, to UKIP in the United Kingdom. We already have too many to name. The idea is to create an international to tear apart the European Union from within. So what we see in Bannon is someone who is a propagandist in the sense that he's able to organize infrastructure. He's able to organize his own media platform in the form of Breitbart News. He's able to find his own funders, namely the Mercer family, quite conservative foundation in the US that supports alt-right platforms. With his knowledge as a venture capitalist coming out of Goldman Sachs, he understands how to organize and control infrastructure. But then he does something that tends to be the work of propaganda artists. He also provides a narrative. So we have infrastructure and we have narrative. And the narrative is crucial because in order to take power, in order to construct reality after one's interests, one needs a story to tell. Where we come from, who are we, and where are we going? And Bannon has this story. We come from the heritage of white Christian civilization. We confront great enemies, but in that process we will refound the idea of economic nationalism, of these grand years from the past. Of course, in the case of the nationalists, alt-right, their narratives are always a kind of weird referral futurisms. Because it's never really about the future, it's always about a past we had, make America great again, that of course never existed. And then we project that past as our collective future. So it's a very strange kind of almost mythological process in which a non-existent past becomes our future horizon. Bannon was able to tell that story. So he operates on these both fronts. Of course, today we see the scale at which the process of reality construction, process of contemporary propaganda in a democracy, because Bannon operates within a still more or less functioning democracy of the United States, has actually been capable of shaping reality after the interests of the alt-right. That brings me to minute 42, but only the second part of the lecture.
Go ahead.
But I promised 45 minutes, so I think I should just stick to that. No? Are you? What?
No, we want to learn how to counter the distraction.
Okay, so does it try to move a little bit faster through this? Because obviously I've been in this work way too long. And the definition of propaganda that I gave so far, of course, is also is very limited, in the sense that traditional propaganda studies tend to focus on who is in power now or who is almost in power, but doesn't really look at emerging powers. So let's say, for example, popular mass movements that have emerged the last 15 years the world over, from the Arab Spring that moved from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria to Los Indignados, M15, the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, Nuit debout. Various mass movements have emerged in the process that most certainly also represent a form of power. They also perform power in some way, even though they are not yet in power. But it seems strange that we would have to consider these as merely counter-propagandists, or as people not even worth talking about developing their own propaganda, their own narratives. There's a particular book by Judith Butler that has discussed this specifically. She speaks about the popular mass movement as a form of performative assembly. So that, if you want to say literally, this is the performance of power, performative assembly. And in Butler's reading, these movements emerge the moment that we experience a form of precarity, a process of our life support structures being taken away, whether it's through criminal mortgage systems, through systemic racism, through the denial of our voting rights. Precarity that brings us to the point where the only thing we can do with our powerlessness is to join others in a kind of shared moment of desperation. But from that moment, in this moment of unchosen assembly, we also start to develop new senses of collectivity. We start to develop new narratives. We start to develop new symbols, new identities. I think the Black Protest is actually, in Warsaw, is actually a very strong example of that, of how there's also an aesthetics, performative aesthetics, that merges with the process of an opposition taking shape. And in that process, we also see how in popular mass movements, in this process of what Butler calls performative assembly, new infrastructures emerge, like the People's Library in Occupy Wall Street. And in the Occupy movement, we saw many of these examples of immediate media channels, on structures of alternative healthcare. In the process of our shared powerlessness, paradoxically, we gain the first step towards a collective power and a collective vision of what is a society that we've been expropriated from and that we want to constitute anew. Now, these examples, I think, can be understood in an inverted version of Chomsky's propaganda model. So, Chomsky and Herman spoke about filters. Propaganda filters defined by control over infrastructure, control over information sources, state views, etc. But in these popular mass movements, the way that Butler describes them, we see something else. Instead of monopolization, they demand democratization, collective ownership over the means of production, collective ownership over public media, over public infrastructures, from healthcare to education, you name it. Instead of source control, we demand public notice, an end to the surveillance system, an end to organizations within our governments that act without democratic consent. Instead of anti-communism identifying a false enemy to create a sense of collectivity, we demand collectivity in the process of re-offering our realities on egalitarian common interests and not on elite interests. Now, these processes, or this idea of an inverted propaganda model, has influenced a lot of my own work, and I'm just going to give you one example, so that I say a bit within time, which is the New World Summit, on an artistic and political organization that I founded in 2012, and it creates alternative parliaments, often temporary parliaments, but not always, in theaters and public spaces and art spaces, for alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. So organizations who, in the last 17 years of the war on terror, have been declared dying in this process of the us and them and divide, defining who is the in-group, us, and who is the out. And for me, this project that involves many different people, architect Paul Pijpers, who's with us tonight, he's been a long-term collaborator in thinking of how such alternative parliaments could look like. It could create a new type of space of performative assembly. The main driving question was, is it possible that between organizations that are prosecuted on the war on terror, so people placed on blacklists, designated lists of terrorist organizations, you name it, and the people in whose name the war on terror is waged, which is us, based on which our states claim legitimacy, they defend us from them. Maybe between us and them there is more alliance than with the states that say that they act and speak on behalf of us. So can we assemble politicized civil society in the West, in whose name the war on terror is waged, against the people who are the targets of the anti-terrorist policies? And of course, the whole history of the designated list of terrorist organizations is a fundamentally anti-democratic policy, in the sense that the people that I've worked with who have been prosecuted as terrorists, placed on terrorist lists, are not able to appeal, and they're not able to go to courts. They don't know who puts them on the list. They don't know when this is decided. It's an organization within the European Union who decides it in our geographic context. And being put on the list has severe consequences. Pulling of your passport, travel ban, freezing of bank accounts. It literally means you're placed outside of democracy because you're considered to be the enemy of democracy itself. And what happened in the process of starting to try to find representatives that we could, through all legal alternatives, bring together in these alternative parliaments, was that, of course, many of these organizations have very particular views of democracy itself. Although these might be fundamentally more militant or more fundamental views of democracy than we know that we have liberal capitalist democratic context. So here we see the first gathering with representatives of the Basque Country, of the Kurdish Women's Movement, of the National Democratic Front Philippines, of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad in the northern part of Mali. And in the process of organizing these alternative parties, the person in Berlin, how you see here you see one in Brussels, is the possibility to create a new, almost kind of parallel United Nations, kind of United States nations between, let's say, the precariat, who have passports, who live in existing states, but are fundamentally ignored, or let's say expropriated given the countries that they live in, and these organizations that sometimes over various decades have struggled for their own right to self-determination and their recognition within larger political scope. You might notice that in the process, shape of these temporary parliaments, they change. Paul and me have worked a lot on the question of what constitutes a collectivity. How many people can be in a state before you no longer feel you are part of that? I think so far we got to something like 225. By the time you go over that, there's a kind of alienation within a group that starts to emerge. What is the performativity of politics? What is the difference between someone speaking at you and someone who sits next to you and seems to speak on behalf of you, as you see here, which most of our parliaments, speakers and audience sit together. The lighting situations are equalized. Speakers are not lighted more than audiences. These specific parliaments, these parliamentary propositions, try to affirm, let's say, affirm, articulate, acknowledge this potential collective power that emerges the moment that different precarious constituents seek each other, motivated by a sense of powerlessness, but in the process of meeting, articulating their own potential alternative paramount power. Now, the latest work of the New World Summit has been in the Rojava region. Rojava means west, refers to the western part of Kurdistan. And that is the yellow area, as you see in the map here, the northern part of what we now know as Syria. So it's a mainly Kurdish, it's originally Kurdish region, but there are many different peoples living there: Kurds, Assyrians, Arabs, in an extremely complex constellation, which they are surrounded on one hand by the remnants of the Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime, remnants of the Islamic State, and of course Turkey, who has waged a decades-long war against the Kurds. But despite this extremely complex constellation, since 2012, in the wake of the continuation of the Arab Spring, in this case, the Kurdish Spring, a revolutionary movement emerged that declared this northern part of the country independent. And they declaring independence under the name of Democratic Confederalism, which Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan explains as a form of stateless democracy, a democracy without the state, democracy based on local self-governance instead of centralized state control. Now, this is an image that you might be a little bit familiar with, the women militia of the Women's Defense Units, the YPG, that have fought on the front lines against the Islamic State, against the Turkish invasion, against the Assad regime. And my next Greek lesson is ready. But an image that might be less familiar is this one. It's an old theater in Hamishla, a city in Rojava, that has been turned into a public parliament. Well, sometimes it still works actually as a theater, sometimes it becomes a parliament, in which this political project of stateless democracy takes place and manifests itself, performs itself. The ideas are as radical as they are simple. The Rojavan autonomous region has levels of governance very similar to the ones that we're familiar with. They start with the commune, then you have the municipality, the cantonal governments, and the transcendental governments. So you could say simply from small to large. The main difference is that in our context, European context, we invest the most executive power on the highest level. And this is where they've turned it around. So small communes have more executive power than overarching cantonal, transcantonal structures. The structure is the same, but the investment of power is completely reversed. Now, members of the Kurdish revolutionary movement and the Kurdish women's movement participated in many of the summits, of these alternative parliaments that we created, invited us to, me and members of my team, to come to witness and document the developments in the Rojava. This is where I met Amina also, at the time the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Rojava region, who, after seeing the parliament proposed to develop a first permanent parliament, to explore this new power paradigm in the Rojava revolution, but try to translate into a foreign. A lot of the parliaments, like one you saw, of the local parliaments of the Rojava revolution, they take place in the old and modernist architecture of the Assad regime. There has not been a lot rebuilt yet, built new. So the challenge was to work with different local political organizations, with Amina, to try to translate how does status democracy translate to foreign? How does power foreign as art, which is the definition with which I started propaganda art. But in this case, a form of power that is radically different than many of the authoritarian examples like the Bannon one I gave earlier on. So the first proposition of Amina that I thought was absolutely brilliant was that it would have to be a public parliament. A parliament is a public space, literally not separated from the larger community, but a parliament that itself is a public ground with a park that we would develop around it. And it will operate as a spatial manifesto. And on these large arches, you see key concepts from the ideas of the Rojava revolution mentioned, such as communal economy, gender equality, the right to self-defense, social ecology. They said that the core philosophical foundations of statist democracy become spatial manifesto. The circular shape, of course, is crucial because it breaks the idea of the representative versus the represented. It allows for kind of communal representation, which the difference between those who speak on behalf of others and those others becomes as small as possible. We started the construction in 2015. As you can see, this kind of almost agora type of circular space really was dug into the ground, was sort of affirming the historical importance of the ideas of statist democracy to this particular region, and step by step emerged from there. It's in a very central location of the city of Derek. It's the first city you enter when you cross the border between Iraq and Syria, so from Iraq to the autonomous region. And the idea would be that different communes of the city could use the parliament at different moments different moments, and at the same time the space would operate as a cultural space, gathering space, that didn't have a larger social function in the parliament alone, which is very similar to the theater I showed you before that becomes parliament at some moment and turns back into theater the other. Probably that's the best theater. The theater is a place of political imagination driven by an artistic imagination, and vice versa. So here we see the opening of the parliament. It took 3 years to finish because of many border problems, because of many of the influence, of course, on the surrounding civil war. And it opened at a terrifying moment for Rojava. The Turkish regime intervened in the canton of Afrin. We are the other side, the canton of Jazira. But nonetheless, it was a moment in which this process of exploring how new forms of power also create new forms, new imaginaries of forms, new imaginaries of gathering, new imaginaries of what is public space, what is communal, could emerge. The rooftop are hand-painted canvases. They represent different fragments of flags from different organizations that drive this project of statist democracy. So they are with a lot of symbolic references to suns and stars that of course have a socialist history, but also proposes kind of almost universalist dome, under which these gatherings take place here at the Albany. So this example, I think, is important because I don't think the world can be divided between propaganda and counter-propaganda. I think there are many there that I think we should discuss propaganda in the plural as propagandas. There are many formations of power in the world. The war on terror is one. Linked to it are formations of alt-right, ultranationalism and Trumpism. But in the rise of popular mass movements the world over, we see a different power paradigm that produces also different forms. So the relationship, propaganda in that sense, propaganda art is very much about the relationship between power and form. And each manifestation of power tries to construct a different reality, and does so through different aesthetic means. And it is continuous conflict of different propagandas. This is in a way where we find ourselves. Our reality is the product of these competing and conflicting propagandas. The case study of Bannon shows the worst possible outcome of how power translates into form. But I hope that with an example like the Rojava movement, it shows that power is not inherently oppressive, that emancipatory forms of power are possible. And that with an emancipatory practice of power also comes new forms of public imaginary, new artistic imaginaries. And I think that this is kind of crucial lesson to learn from this particular movement, because to come back to this notion of post-truth, there is no pre-truth. We have nothing to go back to. The only thing that we have ahead of us are the worlds that we make, that we collectively offer ourselves. And that is why I believe this particular movement shows an abortive horizon, because it shows the possibility of what could be an emancipatory power, and as such also an emancipatory propaganda art. And with that I've come to an hour, so I think now is really enough. And I want to thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, and you. Yeah, I think for this democratic gallery cannot be me entertaining you with the talk Jonas, but rather us sharing our thoughts and ideas, and maybe also questions or objections, whatever comes to your minds.
Well, I was wondering, how is the left sphere now being used? Is it in constant use? Does the community use it? Because with architects and artists trying to shape these gathering places, ultimately failed, like the modernist Polish architect Oskar Hansen. So I was wondering, how did you evaluate? Did you create a communal space where people gather spontaneously, or is it organized in any way? Is there someone oversee what's happening there? Is there a program?
Yeah, so the parliament was commissioned by an Elsa that I mentioned before, but as at Rojava the father's structures are quite reversed. She can propose it, but she cannot decide. So she had to propose the idea to all the local communes. Then the drawings were proposed to the local communes, and feedback came in. Then out of that came the process of building the parliament. So no one was surprised that this thing emerged. Well, okay, after 3 years we were surprised that we actually managed to finish it, but there was already a kind of larger coalition behind creating it in the first place. This I think is a very important part also of the Rojava political model, but it always has to move from the kind of smallest to the largest part of society and back again. And the use is mainly by the local communes, although what I know from the use since April is that it's a lot of public manifestations, so there are a lot of public demonstrations. The meeting point is in the parliament, and as you see here also, it kind of creates an image of gathering, of collectivity, so as a meeting point or as an ending point for speeches and exchanges, it seems to operate best so far. Its use is also slightly defined by weather conditions because the winter is quite cold and the summer has quite warm moments. So there's about 3.5 months a year that is much less in use. And that period of time has this kind of use as of public manifestations. And what we understood from one of the local community leaders that is in contact with my producer, Yunus Bouami, who was on site for almost a year to guide the construction process, is that it now also hosted the first cultural event, and has been mainly used for political purposes.
Yeah, if I may add to this question or comment, I think because now it's very fashionable to criticize modernism and point to its failures, like you mentioned Hudson or
but
it's
yeah, I also wanted to criticize the so-called revitalization efforts done by the capitalist ventures going hand in hand with the current government. But
that there's great documentary on Pruitt Idol housing complex in the US that was precisely this modernist idea to create a huge housing, a block of flats, etc. And it precisely shows that in many cases the problem is that this initiate its architectural or spatial, they function that extremely hostile and degrading social, political, and economic context. So you basically change nothing in the way society functions, economy functions. Then the project fails, and then you say because the idea was bad. Well, as a matter of fact, I think this is precisely a different situation in Rojava, because this is, as Jonas pointed out, this is a very peculiar social and political experiment. So I think we really need to look together to put it in the context. You cannot just say what is the effect or a function of certain material form. You have to see it in a space, in a way of social relations that it's part of. So it fails and succeeds because the entire the entity, this web, functions or does not function.
But I think the question is good, though, and also the question is about what, of course, is like kind of the haunting on modern is because on one hand we know what it means, what are the potential ultimate consequences of molding people and this kind of idea of molding people into a singular idea manifested in European infrastructure and architecture, etc., etc. But now also we know what is even more dangerous, and that is to have no great ideas at all. And that is really interesting. I mean, I thought that we were Paul and you were just at the I forget the full name. It used to be Sally Sauer, but now it's the science, science or power. Yeah. And you see like kind of bizarre conflict between on one hand the kind of a slightly socialist inspired infrastructure, which then completely colonized by open gaming industries that have put their real stands inside. You sound like kind of weird entertainment that has moved seep in. But then we go on the other side, we have like this completely generic banking buildings, the kind of the architectural deregulation. You see like a huge conflict of ideas that kind of like as a wild growth came out of it.
And the Pastor Polchurch has like 2 cinemas, free music clubs, which are actually presenting these venues, which are presenting like concerts, theaters. It has reviews, cinema theaters. I don't see that with those shiny glass towers that are being erected all the time.
Yeah. But then I guess, I'm not saying this to make any positive comments about the Stalinist inspired architecture in any form way, despite my last name. But I think that the risk is if we don't have a plan or a narrative about how to offer our world collectively or in any other formal way, then other people will offer it for us. At this moment, we've handed over the political narrative and cultural and artistic narrative to the wars, rise, the remanifestation of forms of liberal authoritarian neo-fascism that we've seen for a long time. And if we don't have a story to tell in relationship to it and a plan of how to take power differently, then we will lose and we'll live in their world. And I'm afraid it is as simple as that. Any other comments for pursuit?
Were you showing the stills from the Steve Bannon's films? Especially those with the storms and avalanches. I remind a bit of me a bit of the apocalyptic romantic paintings that's been done by either Joshua Reynolds or John Marcus, I think his name. These huge landscape painting where volcanoes were erupting. They use called them the great day of his wrath. We think this apocalyptic imagery, which Steve Bannon is using, is somewhat related to the romantic tradition.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the way you say it makes a lot of sense. So I'm tempted to agree with you. Yeah, that makes a lot. I mean, of course, it has this kind of, it's this kind of Americana romanticism, in which also they call the predatory animals are also the eagles, you know, like the voice on the land. Yes, but no, that's an interesting, that's a really interesting observation. Yeah.
Okay. I think both are very much about the sublime. The Steve Bannon sublime is of course very dark and threatening, but there is this notion of this deep process, overwhelming, this historiosophy. This is very, very much the romantic attitude that Strawberry also takes to.
What I was wondering to ask you, but maybe you all want to escape and go out and smoke cigarettes and drink beers, which I totally understand. But what I was really curious about is when you hear, I know it was clear, when you hear my proposition of how to define propaganda or propaganda art, having lived now since 2015 with the law and justice government and see quite major shifts in media and public life, do you think there's a similarity, or do you think no, it's happening years and completely different? Does it make sense, the question? Yeah. Because, I mean, me and my friends, we follow force a lot of what's happening here also. But I'm not from here, so I only know what I can see from media.
But in a similarity with what's happening in America, or
was it? Do you feel that this idea of how propaganda works for infrastructure and narrative, and I made some references also to this equation here, but of course I do it to someone who's not from here, so I don't know if it makes sense. Do you feel this term propaganda can be applied this way to what is happening in the country right now? Or maybe there are great supporters of law and justice and we just are ways trying up this building and drowning the rivers.
Personally, I feel like I am in crossfire of different propagandas. Like Law and Justice 1, the European Union, it's like big other propaganda. For example, the black nationalist I agree strongly with, so maybe not this one. But the code, no, if you're not potent, is very...
That's basically what you showed, with Constitution. I think it's quite problematic as a post-truth. Because these are people who believe that before Constitution was followed and there has been no problems. And this is precisely wrong, actually. There are many ways in which you can see it's a continuation, or this whole opposition is based on the idea that there was untruth before, which is not true. There was equally, you can see various the points where Constitution was broken, starting from having religion at school. This type of liberals never did anything, but with that. So that's I don't think it's. I see very close resemblance between the Steve Bannon mode of propaganda and also thinking in this huge historiographical terms, like, the nation is going to disappear, cultural Marxism, genderism. Yes, they invented this word, genderism. There's no such thing as genderism. The gender studies. But genderism, it sounds like an ideology. So they want to have ideological opposition that they themselves create, etc., etc. However, this opposing side, called, as you said, the Committee of Defense of Democracy, this is what they call themselves, is this is very much based on this idea that before we had some sort of good democracy, functioning democracy, and everything was okay. So they defended the formal framework of the system. that existed before. So this is a point where we not agree with your presentation. But the other side, yes, at least me, that's my impression. I don't know what you.
Yeah, I could idea with ideas of propaganda, but I cannot think of proper propaganda artists in Poland. Any similar to Steve Bannon, because in a way I agree for artists from propaganda that I can agree with easy, but I cannot find anyone as successful, as good at producing propaganda images in all contemporary. When it comes to images, I mean, not narratives. There are some people who are very good at the area or things. But as you know, Simoleons. Yeah, but this art is not popular. Even like the most important sculpture, the smallest capacitor sculpture, right? Everyone was making fun of it and it's not popular. You know, it's not as popular as Steve Bannon.
I forgot about that. I will agree with you. So I had a conversation with a visiting artist. She was visiting the Center for Contemporary Art last year, and we went to the November 11th Independence March together. And that made both of us realize that this is the form of artwork that is speaking to the people who would be believing in the nationalist cause, because we tend to think, those people the right way. They don't go to art institutions, so they don't have their theaters. They don't have their directors, and if they have the directors, what they're producing is complete rubbish. But such spectacles as the Independence March, it's very powerful visually. It's very powerful on the audio side. It has its. I think I've been trying to analyze it from many perspectives, and from all these perspectives, I think this is our work of art. We can disagree with it ideologically. We can describe it as kitsch, maybe, but
Yeah, the ultra radical football fans. They produce a lot of visual content that is sometimes stunning. They manage to create a image that, you know, it's almost like in North Korea. You see half of the stadium, you know, on the podium, the audience. It's got a huge image of Jesus Christ, and it says "God save the radicals" or "God save the ultras," and they create a lot of imaginary. And I think this patriotic clothes, no, the Ready Spad, yeah, they had this brand, Ready Spad, which is producing clothing with all sorts of, you know, national symbols and anti-communist and anti-leftist in general, and it has been quite it is a kind of niche. It's not a mainstream.
well, it is a brand that's wearing it, because they got several types of it, like the knowledge part, the more comic book oriented part, but we want to turn it into a pop cultural thing.
But so like when Trump retweeted the Peppa meme for the first time, was like an affirmation. These are my people. This is my culture. That's I will.
Yeah, with Red is meant right now they're selling their wares at the national petrol station chain. Not exactly those, not the most radical ones, which tend to show the EU as the Reds, and it's like red is bad, but more of these light, I would say soft ones. But there are many knockoff brands which came after the success of this nation patriotic clothing, and you can see if you go to the markets, those smaller shabby ones, you will see Vietnamese people, Ukrainian people selling those knockoff patriotic clothing from their table house, whose written there.
I think you're on about this mass protest that's performed as something that, of course, it's not meant as art. So I think when you make a distinction like is it art or not, most probably there was not a mass choreographer who thought this is my artwork. But obviously there's a lot of artistic components to it, and we can analyze it as such. Like even if it's not art, we can analyze it as such. There's choreography, there's a script, there's a performativity, there's a dramaturgy. And it's also interesting that I did a little bit of research in the festivals of the French Revolution. And of course, within the French Revolution, there are specifically particular painting to kind of leading figures like David that we remember. But the most important work of these artists was to create festivals, that introduced the new symbols, the new calendar, the new Republican calendar that declared year zero in 1789, the kind of mass choreography with which we turn from a feudal kingdom into a state of citizens, and the idea of art forming this cult of the secular religion. Well, and apart from the question if this was good or bad, if anything it came with the French Revolution, it was obviously a very progressive and very interdisciplinary way of thinking about how art could introduce a new ideas of time, politics, etc. So maybe there are also entry points there. For example, in some of the work that I'm doing now with DA25, the Democracy Hearable in 25, which was founded by Jonas Staal, former Minister of Finance of Greece. So attempt to democratize the European Union from within. And one of the things that I've been working on also with fall is to then develop these large-scale installations in the mass events and mass gatherings. So it's like the stars of the European Union scattered, seeking in the ground or emerging, depending on how bad you think the Union is doing. And then this this logo, the M25, which has this kind of wedges, transforms through kind of Lisitsky, you constructed this kind of trajectory, starts to interrogate the stars of the European Union and force new symbols out of it. And that was, this was like a 4.5-hour event. There was political speeches, but also theater, and kind of like references to ancient tragedies. And it was a really bizarre kind of, in a stadium, turned hard work, turned mass events, try to introduce new symbols around which we would be able to gather from a cultural and political side. So I think that in this mass events, however frightening they might be when they come from an opposite ideology, maybe there's also something to take from that mall. At least the post-law and justice party didn't invent these protests. We can refer to the French Revolution, they were much better appears on that. So this is a thing that also potentially interesting entry there. Fun cons when we add it here.
We go tricks and later.
In any case, it's very interesting to hear also what you said about this being a crossfire of propagandas, like this. But does it also mean that there's no story that's being told that can be supported in that sense?
From me?
Yeah, there's no propaganda that is in 2015 at Azar, for example. There were new stories being told some formal way.
Yeah, I could. In some way, I do that, but it's not like complete vision. It's like, but maybe it's just me personally that I need some kind of politics. And from that, I see much more of this in Athens, in Greece, or in Rojava. It's just more purple.
Yeah. Today I was looking with Pavel Starosbowski, and he was from the theater, and he was saying, I'm here. Yes, I'm there. And you were saying that it was like living under a shock doctrine, when there's like so many shocks that happen at the same time that one moment you're busy trying to defend the constitution that you might not even agree with in the first place, and then already there's a next attack, until you just don't want anymore and you want out. Well, you guys are not going out, and this is very I'm respecting the Norks, but this is of course also the desire of this kind of propaganda crossfire, to say, to come to the point in which you do not want to respond with more at all, like it just makes you numb. But of course that numbness is a benefit for anyone who's setting the propaganda as you is, when they're not resisting or opposing, and of course those who want power compete it, or who have already had it and keep it even more. But it's of course a devastating fact that of propaganda techniques. Babby's when he says kinetic cinema, the kinetic campaign is meant to overwhelm an audience. This is a portrait for you. So somehow it's overwhelming.
But what she said about the narrative, or what she said about the like not being able to find a narrative that she couldn't identify with. I think that's a big problem. Myself, I work for the Bush Gazette propaganda sheet. I'm journalist, and even in our editorial office, we've got flashes on what to support in terms of the opposition in the authoritarian government, and how to react to the protests and the movements like COD, which we don't agree with, but this is the only option that's strong enough to make some kind of difference and put maybe not a stop, but to show the ruling party that they are being controlled. Sorry.
Not even that, unfortunately. They were used on that.
I'm wondering what would happen if they wouldn't go out on the street. I mean,
Same. Because
But fast.
maybe.
we should just ask for what for this. That sculpture that I was all the fake to this altar, supposed truth.
Well, we definitely need a kind of like accelerated, progressive idea of science fiction. Like there's a real production on the real production of the future, so that the present also starts to make more sense by to the present. Maybe it's a last example, because this was last year in the Forum for the Future of Culture here in Warsaw. Would also kind of tend to try to find the narrative even before you speak it, but just through the form. So this is a composition of flags that I painted, starting with the Polish flag. It was called Unionizing the Polish Flag, and then slowly moving, suddenly like these wedges emerging, trying to articulate the kind of place where we want to be. Because of course, I'm an artist, I'm not an ideologue as such. So in a way, also what they're looking for is images that make you want to articulate the narrative towards something. And not in the sense of like, we want to go forward into the future, because I want to go forward, and I also don't want to go backward. I want to get rid of this roll forward, backward bullshit, but something to, like, a world to constitute. So to at least have an image as an horizon that can already kind of motivate us, challenge you to act, even before you're 100% sure what you're acting towards, if nothing else.
I think the problem is because when I heard unionizing, well, of course, it's European Union, but on the other hand, you hear trade unions. And the problem is that most of those people who defend European Union, this union is okay, but trade unions for them are bad because they are liberals. So this is the problem. I think that, and I think it's very much will be that they are losing their war in defense, their battle in defense of European Union, because they cannot get to the point where they accept trade unions. So people would have some sort of collective identity, collective arrangement that would allow them to enact their interests. And precisely because of that, they turn to people who cater to the identities that they have, because religion and nation are the only two collective identities that those people have left, because they were deprived of any sort of class identity or trade union organization. So I think this is what is ironic in the defense, this trying with precisely code, etc., and why they are ineffective is because they only see unionizing in just one sense.
Yeah, the force is also about fight over narrative. I think it's, for example, in relation to what we said earlier about the crossfire of propaganda, I think it's extremely important to reject the European Union, but also reject the nationalists that want out of the European Union. It's about rejecting the propaganda crossfire and how it's articulated to us. The Leave campaign is terrible because it will only support and fuel for nationalist actual separatists and racists. So this is awful. But then supporting the Remain campaign is also awful, because we're supporting an austerity elite that has crushed, I live half family Greece, and they have crushed our society from completely, like, destroy for the next 50 years. So these are, so it's not about Remain or Leave, it's about saying, no, I fundamentally reject this whole question, and we refuse to campaign for either side. We have to be cis. on something else, another union, an alternative union. And of course, then we have to kind of scramble from what we have, what is that story towards that union. But one part of it could be to already begin to mobilize potential imaginer, to articulate this third option out of his false dichotomy, his false choice. Whether it's the us and them divide, the war up there, or whether it's the remain leave propaganda from the over-nationalists on one hand, and the austerity elite on the other.
Thank you. Thanks so much.